Yeah, that's what this is all about, isn't it? Putin wants to hang on to Ukraine as part of his sphere of influence, and Ukrainians have decided they don't want that.
His latest film is Klitschko More Than a Fight, about the Ukrainian brothers who, for over a decade, dominated heavyweight boxing and are both now prominent in politics. Vitali as the mayor of Kyiv and Vladimir, his younger brother, as a special envoy for Ukraine. Roles which mean they are both now fighting a very different opponent in a very different ring. Kevin, why did you think the Klitschko brothers would make a good subject for a documentary? And how aware of them and their work, both in boxing and politics, were you before you started work on the film?
I was not that aware of them. I'm not a big boxing fan, to be honest. I knew who they were. I knew that Vitaly was the mayor of Kyiv. Um, but to be honest, I was so outraged, like a lot of people were, by Putin's invasion and by the ridiculous excuses he made for it, that I just thought, what can I do to help? And I'm a documentary maker and a filmmaker, and I thought, well, how can I make a film? How can I make a film that's going to reach a wider audience than the usual kind of political film, which is seen by a handful of political junkies or people who already agree with me, probably. I thought, how can I make a film about this issue which will be seen more widely? And obviously, sport is a great access to a wide audience. And I thought, oh, these two, Vitaly and Vladimir, if I could make a film about them and what they're doing in Kyiv now, but also tell the story of their boxing careers and kind of find the parallels between these two things, that would be a film that a lot of people would I hope want to watch, and which would help explain for a lot of people who maybe aren't that interested in politics, aren't that interested in the history of Ukraine, what has been going on.
I mean, I didn't realise before I saw your film just what an enormous influence they do have, not just in Ukraine, but in places like Germany and elsewhere because of their enormous boxing career. I mean, they really are kind of titans of the ring, aren't they?
They really are. I mean, for about a decade, they were like the biggest heavyweight boxing champs in the world, and uh, they were both holders of multiple heavyweight belts, but they never unified the belts because they never wanted to fight each other. And there's a very sort of sweet interview with their mum, who was just terrified for both of their safety now, obviously in Ukraine, but I think was even more terrified when there was the possibility that they might beat each other to a pulp. And she actually said to me, the reason I didn't want them ever to fight each other was because I knew that they were both so competitive that neither would ever give in.
Oh God.
And so it wouldn't have ended well. Um, but no, they are genuine superstars in the world of boxing. I think Vladimir, the younger brother, only retired 5 or 6 years ago, and I think is widely regarded as one of the top five heavyweight boxers of all time, really, and actually held many of the heavyweight boxing titles for longer, I think, than anybody else in history.
Now, Kevin, you don't shy away from the word propaganda when you talk about this film. And that is obviously a word that carries a lot of negative connotations for many people. Can you explain why you're happy to be associated with that term when it comes to this film?
Because it's a film with a message. I mean, obviously, people think that propaganda is distorted and is dishonest and inaccurate, but it doesn't obviously have to be. If we think about all the great propaganda films that were made during the Second World War, they were films that were designed to inspire and motivate, to emotionally engage people in the task at hand, which was beating Hitler. And I think we shouldn't be ashamed of the idea that we can make a film now about an equally, in my view, horrible dictator, and say we are trying to motivate people in the fight against them. As I say, I think this film is accurate. It's factual. It lives up to all the kind of all the promises of the term documentary, but it's also clearly designed with a with not just a purpose, but probably a bias, and and I'm not ashamed of my bias.
No, and yeah, I don't even know if it's a bias. If you're aware of it, is it a bias? It probably is, but it's an open bias anyway. A clear bias, a consciousness. Yes. Um,
A consciousness, yeah.
you spent, am I right in thinking, somewhere between 18 months and 2 years in Ukraine making the film?
Well, no, I didn't spend that. That
Well,
was how long
on
it
and
took
off.
to make the film.
Okay.
I wasn't there all that time. I was there. I was there for probably about 6 weeks, and I had a co-director who worked with me, who was a DP who worked with me on this, called Edgar Dubrovsky, who's Latvian and who feels, particularly strongly about, obviously, about this issue. And he was there some of the time when I wasn't. Um, but it's not a place you really want to you really want to spend a lot of time at the moment. I mean,
Mm.
Kyiv is almost constantly being bombarded. You're spending almost every night in a basement somewhere, and it's you don't get a lot of sleep. It's very uncomfortable, but at the same time, it's really inspiring. And I'd never been in a place like that where the population are so determined. They're showing so much resilience, and it sort of shames you, really, when you go home and you sleep in your comfortable bed in England, and you think about all those friends you've made over there who are really leading a very, very uncomfortable life, and yet still now, 2.5 years later, are not ready to give in.
Absolutely. And the situation has shifted again, hasn't it? I mean, what do your Ukrainian friends and colleagues tell you about how the advances into Russian territory have kind of shifted the perception of danger, the morale? There was lots of reports earlier this summer about morale flagging a little bit, and perhaps people feeling like the war couldn't go on forever. Has the sort of pushback changed things?
My sense is that yes, it has. I mean, one thing that I really notice with Ukrainians is they have a fantastic but very dark sense of humor, and they're all really enjoying the kind of the discomfort and the ironies of this situation, that now they are the occupier. So even though maybe the actual amount of land occupied by the Ukrainian forces is pretty small. I think that there's something about that reversal which they really like. And I think, my sense is that, if I was had to go to war, and by the way, if you're a Ukrainian man, I think you're eligible to go to the front line till you're 65. So I'm 57. I already feel like I'm over the hill, but God, I would have another 8 years or whatever of being liable to go to the front line. But I think there's nobody I would rather march behind than Vitali Klitschko. I mean, he's like the real life, commando, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger or something. He's 6'8" or
Yeah.
9. He's built like a brick shit house. He's incredibly commanding and forceful as a personality. So um, they have some great leaders.
Yeah. As you know, I've also been out to Kyiv now to meet them. And I've got the best picture that has ever been taken in the world of me between Vladimir and Vitali Klitschko, in which I look like a different species at 5'4". I would definitely march behind them, but I'd probably prefer that they carried me, actually. But going back to them as people, I mean, they do have this extraordinary physical presence, because they're sort of 6'7" and 6'6", and absolutely enormous, and still in extraordinary shape for men of the early 50s and late 40s. And they still look like they could knock you out in a ring if they wanted to. But they also do have this amazing backstory, don't they? Can you just give us a little potted biog of sort of where they came from, and how they ended up doing a sport that they weren't allowed to even watch when they were children?
Yeah, I think boxing was kind of considered to be decadent in the Soviet era, and they were originally into sort of mixed martial arts, into kickboxing, and that was actually banned. And they used to, when they first started studying that, it was because they had seen people like Chuck Norris and Schwarzenegger in American movies, and they wanted to be like them, and they wanted to be able to fight like them. And they had their walls in their bedroom plastered with all these pictures of these great Hollywood action stars. But they used to have to go into the woods to train, to do their kickboxing training because it was illegal. And then when it became legal in the last year of the Soviet Union, so I guess it was 1989, is it? They Vitali was the Soviet champion. He went on a tour of America and fell in love with America. Fell in love with. There's a very funny moment in the film where he talks about the power of Coca-Cola over him and how, how this was just the greatest thing ever, downing buckets of Coca-Cola. But then he describes how he went back to the Soviet Union, to Ukraine, and his father was quite a senior officer in the Ukrainian or Soviet military, and his father was a real true believer in the communist system, and he said to him, everything you've been shown, my son, is a lie. You were taken to a city that was specially constructed for foreigners to entrap them. This is not really what America is like. They're a terrible enemy. And it took him years, literally, to persuade his father that that was not the case. But so the father actually is also. There's another fascinating element of the backstory that involves the father, which is that he was actually involved in the attempt to rescue the Chernobyl nuclear reactor when it went up, and he was actually stationed there at Chernobyl for several weeks. And when the accident happened, and I think he was in charge of the helicopters. And if you remember from that amazing TV show that was made about Chernobyl, they dropped all this sort of sand and stuff onto the reactor to try and tamp down the reaction. And a lot of his friends, a lot of the father's friends, died as a consequence of that. And in fact, their father did die prematurely of a kind of cancer, which is specifically people who have been exposed to radiation get. And this in itself, as you learn in the film, was one of the motivating factors for Vitali getting involved in politics, because when his father died in the early 2000s, he was entitled to a military funeral. And the man who came to sort of tell them about the military funeral said, well, you can only have this military funeral if you bribe me. And Vitali was so infuriated. He said, what has happened to this country? What do we stand for if we're going to make somebody pay a bribe for the military funeral that they're entitled to because they died for their country because of radiation sickness? And that, in his description, is the thing that really motivated him to get involved in politics himself.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And I think that the other aspect of it that I took from your film, that his pro-European stance was also another huge motivating factor. That he was really involved in the Maidan protests in 2013 and 2014 when Ukraine was on the verge of sort of dealing more closely with Europe, and then obviously that was abandoned, possibly under pressure from Putin. And he is incredibly pro-European, isn't he? And that's a big part of what he is sort of constantly pushing for in Kyiv, is much closer links and hopefully European integration for them at some point, getting away from former Soviet influences.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that he described to me how when he was in the late 90s, early 2000s, he was living in Germany, which is where his boxing career really took off. Both the brothers were living there. And every month or two, he used to drive back home through Poland to go to Ukraine to see his family. And he said, he could see year after year as Poland thrived and everyone became much better off, and you could see democracy in action in the country. But every time he arrived over the border in Ukraine, things had not changed, and he attributed this to the fact that, well, Poland is part of the EU. Poland has adopted a democratic system, and Ukraine has not, because Ukraine is still under the shadow of Russia. And so there you have the two sides of this battle being, you see them very clearly there in that instance. And he right from 2004, in fact, when there was another a kind of peaceful series of demonstrations called the Orange Revolution, which he supported and talked about after his fights, in fact, how he supported Europe and how he supported the values of the Orange Revolution. From 20 years ago, effectively, he has been one of the most vocal proponents of moving towards closer ties with Europe. And I think that that's really that's what this is all about, isn't it? Putin wants to hang on to Ukraine as part of his sphere of influence, and Ukrainians have decided they don't want that. The majority of them have decided they don't want that. They want to move more towards a European system and more towards Europe. And that's why in 2014 Putin invaded and through his proxies in Donetsk, and there's been effectively 10 years of conflict since then, which only became full-blown war 2 years ago. But I think the film explains all of this through the personal experience of Vitali and Wladimir, and I think hopefully for people who are more interested in the boxing, you see that metaphor and of the sort of the man who will not give up the fight. You see that realized in the various boxing matches that you see in the film.